You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. It's been a while since we last presented a work by Malcolm Ferguson. Previous offerings include the Polar Vortex and the Thomas Chadwick Mysteries. Check the video description for a link to the Malcolm Ferguson playlist. Today's story is called Croatan, first published in the July 1948 issue of Weird Tales. Creatures summoned from outer eons are masters by an eternity of time and progress. We hope you enjoy this one, folks. Croatan by Malcolm Ferguson. I am being held in the case of the mysterious disappearance of my friend, John Saunders, whom I visited at the hospital of St. Anthony, outside Roanoke, Virginia. I will not be held long, because I am responsible neither for his disappearance from an escape-proof upper-story room, nor, for that matter, for the equally strange cause of his admission to that hospital room. For there are two mysteries, one inside the other. To begin with, it was a mystery why John Saunders lay sick, and that sick he, for the moment clairvoyant, should speak of matters he knew not, and hint gravely, in a voice not his own, of mysteries beyond his ken. I knew him well, having often visited his house and the nearby workshop from which emerged the painted tiles, the pottery ware, and more recently the glassware which made his reputation. I had watched these creations grow under the young man's deft hands. I had argued with him about the folk aspects of this work, or rather examined his knowledge upon the subject, being frequently surprised by the depth of interest and knowledge of the tall, blond, boyish-looking young man. It was, in fact, only 2 days after I had left his house that I read the strange item in a Washington newspaper. There had been a fall of brown snow near Roanoke, a fall localized to a radius of about 4 miles. Brown snow. That was certainly odd, I thought, determining to call John up on the phone. No doubt he would go to the scene to study it. Surely he could identify the alien substance if anyone could. He answered the phone on his workshop extension. "Yes, I have some of the stuff under the microscope now," he replied to my query. "And it's like nothing else on Earth that I know of. The particles are apparently crystalline, though they change shape rapidly, their movements making them seem alive or imbued with a lifelike energy. I want to try some sort of spectroscopic examination on them next, though I don't know offhand how I'll go about it." Whether he made a spectroscopic examination of the particles or not, or the exact nature of his difficulties in doing so, I never asked him, nor would I have understood in detail if he told me. I had learned that this substance was mystifying John, and I felt that my curiosity didn't justify me in distracting him further at that moment. Then, too, I was quite busy in Washington, and heard nothing further until the newspapers announced 2 days later the sickness of John Saunders and 2 other men, a newspaper science editor and an amateur scientist, all associated, apparently, with the study of this brown snow. The next morning, a telegram arrived urging me to come to the hospital. I drove down early in the afternoon. Saunders, who had asked that it be sent, was apparently permitted to see me, though I marveled that he wasn't put in isolation, his ailment being of undetermined nature and origin, and quite possibly contagious. I am no scientist, so I wondered why Saunders had called me instead of one of his friends among recent tech graduates. He was lying down in bed, quite pale, but in no apparent discomfiture at the moment. "Well," he said, our greetings over, "it caught me with my guard down. I expected radioactive elements and found no danger there. But germs? I had no way of guessing, or of detecting them without risk if I had guessed. So I found myself suddenly coming down with a violent chill. I was barely able to summon help. But, that isn't why I called you. I've been experiencing something quite alien to myself. It is as if my sickness called forth some urgent message. Hell, I'm not psychic or anything like that, but there seems to be something rational and also pretty urgent to it. So, if I can let myself relax and let this thing unfold without tightening up on myself as I naturally would if I were alone, maybe we can find out if it really is anything. Just in case this is lucid and of any account, I want you to get it down in shorthand. There are pencils and paper, my friend. You will forgive me, I hope, if this is babbling insanity. I am sure that it will be a relief to me if there is nothing to it. It is for you, then, to copy and record, and it is for me to prepare the apparatus, plug in, as it were, the electricity, and adjust the phonograph, so that if a record is inserted, it will be transmitted. Very well. My mind focuses, as before, on a beech tree, with the word Croatan crudely carved on it with a hasp knife. I know something of this. Maybe you too are acquainted with the grim jest of fate, wherein the last survivor seeks to express the enigmatic end of his tribe by carving letters on a tree trunk before his end also comes. His word can serve only to point up the mystery. Let us hold to this mystery, which I recognize as the sign of doom of the lost colony at Roanoke, here in Virginia in 1587, under Sir Walter Raleigh's patent. Perhaps the matter of the mystery will be thus. Surely we should know. For if it happens again, and well it might, there might be none left on the face of the earth to puzzle over the few hastily scribbled words of the last to be snatched up, and that would be ironic too. It would be the ultimate irony, deserving to outlast paper, beech bark, and even the slow-crumbling face of stone, a cryptic Croatan, or whatever the word would then be, unread in empty continents, one word nearer an explanation than the empty shells of New York, London, Paris, Moscow. Yes, we are on the trail. My hunch has hit it. We are on the low shores of Roanoke, in what was to be Virginia. John Saunders' voice changed somewhat at this point, being a little less polished, more rough and ready. I was busy transcribing, and could not notice it too closely. I continue, without the burden of quotation marks, the story that John Saunders dictated to me from the hospital bed. In the autumn of 1587, our party of 89 men, 17 women, 2 children, and the newborn Virginia Dare watched the ships of the Virginia Company put out to sea. Most of us stood by the shore until the ships had disappeared over the horizon. Then, just as the sails dropped from sight and we were turning back, tiny Virginia Dare commenced to cry, a piteously small noise against the vast expanse of sea and woods. For my part, I felt in that moment the loneliness and weight of work of the winter ahead more than at any other time before. We would indeed have our hands full until the return of the ships, due to arrive a year hence with good supplies and capable colonists to add to our numbers. It was as carpenter that my name went down on the register, Amos Martin, carpenter, and I was busy from dawn until dark, and sometimes by torchlight for even longer, working with axe and adze, saw and sledge completing the necessary buildings, amassing firewood, and building fishing vessels. Others, women as well as men, were busy hunting and trapping, and gathering such herbs and mushrooms as they could be sure of in a new world. Still others were out fishing. 4 of us, all bachelors, shared one log hut, with a stone chimney in whose fireplace we did our cooking, using a number of devices contrived by Ashur Dakin, the large, amiable, bearded blacksmith who slept on the balsam boughs of the bunk below me. At first, we were fortunate in that our work went well, and our health remained good. Nothing beyond comprehension had then assailed us, either from the vast width of water behind us, nor the unknown forest before us. Work was our friend against the natural uneasiness that was otherwise our portion, with winter approaching. Do you know the feeling of waiting that comes before a snowstorm? The air is arush with the countless tiny particles. One night was ominously like that. If only that night had brought nothing but snow with it. The next morning the sky was clear, and on the ground 6 inches of snow had fallen. It was a strange, brown snow, with particles of some sort in it. As we gathered in the clear air that morning, we asked one another whether this was the kind of snow to expect in the New World. I have reason to remember that snowstorm well, for from the time of its descent we were in the custody of unknown and baleful forces. Not that there was any marked change as we stood at the doors of our huts and surveyed the snow-covered ground, but during the day some of us felt uneasy. I know I did. 4 times I saw from the corner of my eye alien black blobs in rapid flight, waist-high, going 50 feet before I lost sight of them. That night began the epidemic of chills and fevers that put to bed an increasing number of us. We were thus burdened with the problem of keeping one well person in each hut to look after the others, and above all to keep the fires going. The first 2 weeks were terribly hard for sick and well alike. It was then that something occurred that terrified me so that I could not decide whether my reason or my memory were affected. I went to the spring one evening, carrying 2 buckets and an axe to cut the ice, and the chance that it had frozen since the last man had chopped it. There I met a man whom I had never seen before. I gasped, "Who are you?" He replied, "Charles Swain." "What, you don't know me, Amos Martin?" I stammered something about being tired, so that I hardly knew myself. The man acted as if he understood, and passed off my original ignorance as a fault of overwork. I looked at him as I filled my buckets. He wore his clothes strangely, with an exactness as if they were costumes and alien to him. His face was strangely pale, and its lines and wrinkles had an unnaturalness to them, as if they had been erased by some shock and come back awry. He stood there, presumably waiting to fill 2 buckets of his own, though I'm sure I don't remember, for I was preoccupied by the unhuman strangeness in his pose and manner, which I could not understand, but could only ask myself, what in hell is so horribly wrong here? If you had been aboard the ships with fewer than 200 men, and then ashore with 89, as I had, you would know each of them by name so that you could call them off. That is exactly what I did. I counted as I walked back with my 2 full buckets, and I had 89 names without Charles Swain. And yet the man knew my name. He was surely no Indian. He acted as if he belonged, his errand at the spring being presumably as legitimate as my own. I told Ashur Dakin of my strange encounter. He knew of no such man either, by name or description. He thought, quite naturally, that I might be suffering from the unknown epidemic, a thought which I had conceived of, but rejected as unlikely, for I had not felt dizzy, nor as if the core of me were frozen, as all the others had. Were these things to be expected in the New World? Brown snow, a strange plague, the coming into being of a strange man, or his semblance? One would know if one were back in England. One would know indeed with fear, but who could say here, or where could one seek among writings? Perhaps the snows are often brown here, and mean nothing, or that one adapts oneself to the plague and can defy its hurtful humours. Perhaps. Then came the first of the plague deaths, coming in the cold night, and only after the moment of death's impact was it recalled that those who gathered in the night, and likewise those who in the morning interred the body in the sea, had seen a man whom they did not know among their number. There was then a belated alarm, and there was greater credence of my account of meeting Charles Swain. Some attempts were made to link the death with this man's appearance, though no headway could be made with this idea. During the next 5 days there were 7 deaths, and several times he who called himself Charles Swain was seen, though he avoided seizure largely by the unexpectedness of his appearance. Ashur Dakin saw him leaving one hut. Rufus Pinchbeck met him while hurrying to the Lispreys, where a woman had died. Once, Alan Duncan came toward his cabin with an armful of firewood, and saw Charles Swain leaving. Duncan dropped the wood, and futilely hurled one stick after another at the departing figure, who leered like Silenus over his shoulder. And Duncan pursued him, though with no success. Returning, he found that one of his cabin mates had died, and the other 2, both sick men, were nowhere in sight. Yet the snow bore only the trace of Charles Swain's footprints, coming and going. After that, we went armed. Occasionally at first there was hope of help from Indians, those near us being friendly, but now they shunned us, and we saw them only extremely rarely, and then in apprehensive flight. Our meetings were desperate affairs, with far-fetched plans hazarded and rejected. It was at one of these, however, that the idea was considered that Charles Swain was not human, but something which had borrowed human form, evil, the pestilence that walketh. Among us then was death, and yet more terrifyingly, disappearance, for there was no trace of the 2 men who had been plucked from the snowbound cabin. I talked with an older man, Walter Pinchbeck, an able husbandman, and something of a scholar who was stricken with the plague. What he said was not sense, I thought then, but I remembered it. I have dreams that terrify me in a way that no thought of death or aught else ever has. There is within me, I dream, a teeming host of tiny atomies, alive and aswim, that engineered this plague. Terrible behemoths, yet encompassed in each drop of my ichor. Their writhing is my torment. And these atomies in turn are but earthly projections of kindred life from far space. They are seeds, spawn, germans of space creatures, and I have seen them too, these space creatures, also alive and aswim, or afloat upheld in a vast, dense cloud of the brown particles which make the snow brown. Totally alien, they live within this cloud, not as we live on the earth, but suspended as in a sea, only a sea of dry particles. It is a fearful, blind world, and in my dream it was as if I went among ghosts. But most terrible of all were the creatures themselves. One came toward me, a huge tower of glossy leather, topped by numerous tentacles which took the place of eyes and ears in that dense medium. Beyond the sense of feel, whatever senses and capacities this creature had must have been within itself, so that it could learn only by taking up smaller objects into the orifice at its top for examination, or by hitching itself with its flat base, clinging to any of the larger, lifeless objects, and somehow feeling and communicating with its kind. But of that I do not know, for it was then that my son woke me in a cold sweat. Shortly after this, Walter Pinchbeck, too, had vanished, and in the days that followed I thought of his unbelievable tale of atomies within him. Surely I had no such atomies within me, or of creatures haunting a cloud in the depths of space. Then, as time went on, I wasn't so sure in my disbelief. Perhaps a fever would make me feel and then make me know things that I now doubted, and those things might some day be known to be so. Can anyone know the loneliness that was upon us? There were other deaths and disappearances, including as missing the 2 men who shared the hut with Ashur Dakin and myself. As Dakin and I committed a body to the waves, it seemed to me as if we had suddenly grown smaller against the vastness of the ocean and clear cold sky with the solitary gull wheeling and crying overhead. We became moody. Each person wondered if the number of human faces he would live to see was becoming daily smaller. We ached for the old world, though I did hear conjectures that these strange times might somehow be affecting our homeland too. Then, late one afternoon, I returned to our hut. Inside the cabin was dark, coming in out of the snow. I saw a figure on the bench by the fire. I thought it was Ashur, and started to greet him, and then I saw with horror that it was not Ashur at all, but Charles Swain. Indescribable was my terror at that meeting, which by its absolute unexpectedness and the bold indifference of my adversary completely stunned me. I could only stand and gape, now noticing that Swain's neckcloth was missing, and the flesh of his throat showed signs of a rope's abrasion. "Well, Amos Martin, we meet again. Since this is obviously my doing, you must content yourself that you can do nothing about it, nothing but listen to your fate. For soon we from the great cloud and the outer marches of space will have taken those of your colony whom we have chosen. For your part, it is my grim jest that you be left alone after we have taken our desired number for experimentation, allowing that some will be broken in death. We are obviously choosing your little colony for our experiments because it will give us a working supply of human beings who will not be missed. Why should we raise a hue and cry? As for you, Amos Martin, 1 human, more or less." By then, I had put down the sack I was carrying, and with a dart seized up one of Ashur's hammers and hurled it where I had last seen Charles Swain. Even before the hammer skittered futilely along the table, I saw that Charles Swain had gone. Mockingly, a pile of clothes were left. I ran. I hardly knew where, but at last I was tolling the bell in the community hall. When the men came, I gasped out my story, and we went up to my cabin. They listened with apparent belief and sympathy, I thought, and they saw the clothes on the floor as I had left them. But as time went on, and it was certain that Ashur too had vanished, and that 3 others had gone that same night, there was muttering against me, as if I were in league with this devilish Charles Swain and the unearthly forces. For I had been told that I was to live, and that they would die. But could not these people see that my fate promised no better than theirs? True, my chance of being rescued by the relief expedition would be the greatest, though somehow I felt the ships would never come in time. I knew that it would be diabolic to wait as the slash of fate cut all around. Once again our numbers were heavily cut. I did what I could along with the rest, but more than once the sick refused the cup which I held at their lips, and more than once I was warned off with threats. Some of the cooler-headed men of the colony came to see me, and they expressed concern that I was becoming more of an outcast in the eyes of their colleagues when another pair of hands was so earnestly needed. There was little they could do, they and I realized, understanding that despair was undermining reason. There were now barely 40 persons left in the colony, and all of them were men. And I could help no longer, for desperation had made many of the remaining men little better than beasts as concerned me. So I fretted and stirred impatiently, realizing that I was thought of as lurking here, a warlock scheming evil in my solitude, or possibly harboring the evil genius, Charles Swain. And then one night There was a clatter at my door, and young Pinchbeck burst in. "You'd better leave, Amos Martin. They're coming to hunt you down. Grab what you can and run. There, now I've told you. I better not be here when they come." Was it cowardice that made me set to work gathering up what I needed? I wondered at the time whether I should wait it out. However, I set about packing, impelled to flee, with the little I could gather quickly. I didn't know when they would attack the cabin, but believed I would have a good chance of taking my hastily gathered supplies and skirting camp to an inlet where I could get a rowboat. Believing I should put 10 miles between us, I chose as my destination an island we had called Croatan, for thus the Indians had named it. I found the boat all right, and had rowed 5 miles when I saw a glow from the camp that I believed was my cabin burning. What misguided souls, wasting their precious substance thus wrathfully and vainly. Now indeed, I reflected, they would surely think me a warlock for escaping them, and I would be outcast indeed. For the next week I was busy building a passable shelter, as well as hunting and fishing. My struggles to live were occupying me again, though I still fretted about the colony and longed to be with my fellow men again, deluded though they were. Now I made no attempt to hide. I had merely removed myself, feeling that I should not let my blood be shed too readily, and my axe blows rang freely. If anyone chose to kill me, they might do so, merely at the expense of search and contrivance. Finally, my yearning to be among men impelled me to return by boat to the mainland, and, afoot, to the edge of camp. I took up a number of positions and watched to see who remained alive. Watching all morning, I could count only 12 men, and allowing for those absent hunting or otherwise occupied, I felt their numbers had dwindled to 30. So I returned to my camp, cold, hungry, and in anguish at the lot of my fellow men. On the 6th day following, I was out hunting, and heard a shot nearby. I placed myself in a likely position, and soon saw it was young Pinchbeck. I hailed him. He was startled both at being hailed and at finding me still alive. He was extremely nervous and apprehensive in talking to me. Obviously, the mounting anxiety of the men was wearing him down, for I knew what a terrible thing the restlessness of a doomed group is. "There are 24 of us alive now. Edgley drowned himself, and Thomas went mad and was killed. The plague seems to be over, and no one else dies from it. They just disappear. And some of those who remain are dangerous in their desperation, unwilling to work, drinking liquor when they find it, and brooding murder on anyone whom they fancy a Jonah." And then he begged me that he might stay with me, urging that it would be as if he had disappeared, and he would thus be saved from the fear-crazed men, for neither he nor I were of a humour that made for such madness. I accepted his offer. Maybe I was wrong, but I accepted. Thus to draw from the strength of the main body seemed sinfully wrong to me, yet I was grateful to have young Pinchbeck's company. And perhaps, I argued, he might somehow escape through this change of scene. For all this while I believed the hateful prophecy of Charles Swain, that I alone would linger alive. So we two lived apart for 3 weeks, as under our occasional observation the desperate colony dwindled more alarmingly. Then one evening, as we gathered wood for the fire, Pinchbeck, who was between me and the fire chopping at a log, dropped his axe and screamed, clawing at his shirt. Suddenly, he was no longer there, nor was there any use searching, for I knew that the earth no longer held him. That night I wept, and under the vast, clear, starlit sky I cried out at the terrible void. I don't know what I did. I was distraught. The air seemed to weigh heavily about me and yet be limitless, and I felt that Ruthless, unearthly creatures observed my every move, seemingly touching and handling me as surely as if I were in some unimaginable marketplace. The depths of the air swallowed my screams, and I knew not whether the creatures heard me and mocked, or whether I went unheeded. The next morning, weakened in mind and body, as if only a spider web held me from the collapse of the one or the other, I went back to the colony. I drew my boat up on the beach. I walked up the path to the community hall. No one was in sight. I cried out. No one answered. I broke into a sprint and staggered from cabin to cabin, peering at empty interiors, calling in vain. And then I opened the 6th cabin door. On the floor was a man, white-haired, outstretched, writhing. I rushed forward and clasped him to my bosom, but the man to whom I opened my heart was hopelessly crazed, I saw. He whom I had known as Darius Malum, a 20-year-old youth, lay gibbering incoherently, his whitened hair and fumbling, useless hands a jest to me. I went no further in my search, but stayed, seated on a bench, watching the brain-broken creature on the floor. I knew that he was the last man. And as I sat there, face in hands, in utter despair, the voice of Charles Swain spoke from the idiot lips of the unheeding man on the floor. "So, you came back. You are now the witness and the listener, and this is as it chanced through our contriving. One mortal was to stay, we agreed, so that if none of the others were carried across successfully, we would come here instead, as I did, taking the form of Charles Swain from a hanged body which I plucked from an English gibbet. You see, we who live within the great cloud, whose particles are like that which you saw in your brown snow, have not senses like yours, our mode of living being quite different. We have taken human beings to study their structures, that we can will adaptations in our own, or possibly take over the earth, after clearing it of its mortals and other uncongenial elements. Oh, there are various courses open to us, as long as we're careful. Thus we prudently leave alone the main body of mankind to pick this colony. You, however, I shall use for one more experiment." Then Darius Malum was again incoherent for a moment, but suddenly he gripped my ankle, stared straight at me, uttered my name, and was gone. Gone, and I alone remained. It is strange that the will carries on when the mind no longer can. I left that cabin and, going to a beech tree nearby, hastily carved the word Croatan on its bark with my hasp knife, hoping that men from the rescue ships would see it and come. And with faltering feet I left the colony for my island retreat, taking nothing with me, caring little what would come to pass. Numb. I remained there, my mind mercifully dulled so that I was quite beyond minding the solitude and existing through habit. Fortunately, winter was quite over, and living was easier, though my nerves made me a poor marksman, being afraid instead of eager to shoot when I heard a noise in the underbrush or sighted game. I avoided camp still, doing without its supplies, though realizing that in time I would have to return or add measurably to the burden and futility of my labor. I held out until late summer before I went back to the colony to fetch supplies, choosing a warm, sunlit morning for this unpleasant scavenging. I had drawn my boat up handily on the beach, and entering the nearest hut quickly chose an armful of necessary items. Thus laden, I turned. I had reached the doorway when I saw it. My God, but the horror I saw there, the vast, leathery horror, topped by a ring of tentacles, with a gaping orifice in the center of this top, a towering 20-foot height looming up scarcely twice its length from me. I clung to the sides of the doorframe, my knees refusing to support me. I must be mad, I told myself over and over. This thing cannot be. But it was there, twisting and posturing on its base, now towards me, now away. How I broke away, kicked clear my utensils, and swung shut the door, I will never know. I know only that I am inside, leaning against the door which I have barred. I hear strange noises outside, rubbings against the log walls, a weird, throaty humming, out of which wail strange syllables. And now, as I hastily shred up the blanket, the voice of Charles Swain comes clearly. So now you have seen me as I am, and I have shown myself that I can appear visibly on this earth. Even as I am, I will still be, when one day the race of man is no more, and we have come. But now I have twisted my blanket rope, and made it fast to the rafter. But wait, I must prevent my body being used, as was that poor unfortunate's on the gallows back home. Yes, fire will do it, if anything will, if only time permits. There, a blaze now, another, now 2 more. Now a kick of the stool, and Roanoke is no more, and Croatan yields nothing either. But I can hold no longer, save in seeking death. Slowly, the figure of John Saunders on the hospital bed began to stir, the mind to come back into its own. Well, was it babbling idiocy that we heard? I nodded negatively. Do you think that it was an unconscious rationalization of my own of this virus-bringing brown snow? I don't think so, John, since it is hardly likely your mind would work out unaided a number of details. Consider, for instance, that the deaths yielded to the disappearances, which occurred to me later as likely if this cosmic cloud spawn were engaged in kidnapping the colonists. Their earlier attempts would be less likely to succeed than their later, naturally, and deaths would result. Then, too, the brown snow itself and your own sickness cannot be denied, and remain to be explained. Yes, but we can hardly depend upon ourselves to come up with the correct solution to such phenomena out of hand. It's worth consideration, though. Imagination is often the father of invention, if we can allow, as here, that projection is part of it. Let us agree, then, to this story's validity, since it seems unlikely that a new virus could come from an earthly source thus late in the game of cataloguing, and more likely that it came from space. As to the possibilities of a cosmic cloud harboring a higher form of life, that is admittedly new to me. But if these things are so, we must begin to venture preventative steps. We have advantages. These cloud creatures are predisposed by their more limited senses to inductive reasoning, whereas we can use deductive reasoning more fully. We may be able to immunize ourselves, and I think we will find that projection of impulses to their cloud, if the cloud can be found in good time, as is likely, may be effective. I think that both electricity and fire may be inimical to them. John Saunders was going to add something, but stopped, his features suddenly contorted, galvanized into an alarming rictus. And then it was that I made an error that may have proved fatal, for in a moment a voice from John Saunders said, urgently, "Open the window quickly, for heaven's sake!" And I turned to do so. Fool that I was! For in the moment that my back was turned, something materialized in that hospital room, seized up a water pitcher, and knocked me senseless. Something I dimly remember glimpsing from the corner of my eye before I went down, like the mummified figure of a man, head a-loll, and the dried flesh of his neck twisted and pulled awry, as if by a hangman's noose. When I recovered consciousness, John Saunders was gone, and I now realize that possession of his mind came just before his injunction about opening the window. There are forces loose in the world that must be controlled. I fear that the acute mind of my friend John Saunders will be sorely missed in time to come. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,